Hey guys, welcome back to Willpower Garage. Today we're working on a 2011 Audi Q5 with a 2-liter TFSI motor. If your car has the low oil pressure warning light coming up on the dash, you might want to follow along to see how we figure out what's wrong. Stay tuned. Okay guys, so you're driving along, everything looks fine, you come to a traffic light, all of a sudden you see the dreaded red oil light come up on the dashboard with a warning sign that says low oil pressure, shut off engine immediately, all kinds of warnings. Looks really scary. It potentially can be. So in this video, what I'm going to go through is some of the steps I do to see, and for the major part, to actually verify that it is indeed a low oil pressure issue and not just the oil pressure switch giving you a false warning, because they are known to fail. They have failed in the past. I've changed numerous amounts of pressure switches. On this particular TFSI, it is what I would consider a case of German over-engineering. This has a 2-stage oil pump, so it basically is a low volume oil pump and a high volume oil pump that is controlled by an electronic solenoid. It also, because of that, has 2 oil pressure switches, one basically to just report the oil pressure, and the second one to monitor that that oil pump is switching over to the high volume when needed. I do have 3 faults in the ECU for both pressure switches, as well as the cam fault. I will put those P codes in the description below. They'll probably be in the title as well, which will help you find this video. But because of that cam position fault, it really led me to believe that this is an actual low oil pressure issue. There is sort of a range where that pressure should be at idle, and I am sort of at that borderline pressure. So in this video, I really just want to show you guys some of the test procedures I do to verify the oil pressure. And we're going to go into, we're basically going to tear this engine apart till we find what is possibly causing the oil pressure issue and what we're going to do to fix this. So this may end up being a multi-part video. We'll see. You guys, your guess is as good as mine. We're going to dig into this thing together. So first things first, we're going to scan the ECU and we're going to see what faults are there. Since I had already looked at this, I've got a couple of different faults than what I described to you prior. I do still have the log file up so I could show you guys exactly what the faults were when the car was first brought to me. I don't know if this is going to show up on camera, but the faults I have is a P164B malfunction, which is for the oil pressure switch. I have a P164D, which is the oil pressure switch for reduced oil pressure, as well as a P0341 for the camshaft position sensor. So these are the faults I initially saw when the car was brought to me. And when I was trying to go through some of the basic steps, just so I can verify that this for sure was a low oil pressure issue, I cleared the faults and I continue to get oil pressure switch faults. The one that you see down here, though, that's just because I was disconnecting the oil pressure regulating valve. Basically, if you disconnect it, you should get full oil pressure volume. And I did that just to see that the oil pump was actually changing pressure. One of the other things we could check here, we're going to go back, we're going to go into the instrument cluster. And from here, if we go to measure value block 1, we could see the oil pressure. So unfortunately, on the Volkswagen and Audis, they don't actually give you a pressure number. It's basically just minimum or okay pressure. This one obviously showing minimum. It is at idle. The engine doesn't sound loud by any means. But what I'm seeing is when I rev this up to that 2000 RPM range or so, my oil pressure should increase or change over, and I should not see minimum. In this, I'm still seeing minimum. It doesn't change. I have to rev it up much, much higher before it actually changes over. So from there, that's one of the other indications. Okay, perhaps I have low oil pressure. It could be an oil pressure switch. Now I need to put on a mechanical gauge so I can actually verify that the oil pressure is indeed low. All right, guys, so I already have an oil pressure gauge set up for this, but I just want to sort of give you a rough overview of what you need to do, or the best place to tap into to actually monitor the oil pressure to verify. So top engine cover needs to come off. Depending on if you have a Gen 1 or a Gen 2 TFSI motor, the oil pressure switches are in two different locations. So there's one pressure switch that's up here, and then the second one is down here. This is what the oil pressure switch looks like that you're going to be removing. It's just threaded into the port just below the oil filter. The other generation has both of the pressure switches basically on top of each other. I'm using a Fluke style transducer. Basically, it's an electronic device to monitor pressure. I hook this thing up to a multimeter, and the digital signal will actually give me a pressure. You can tap into this with just a regular analog gauge. That'll work just fine as well. Just make sure that it reads in increments, at least 1 psi. Basically, at idle, you should see at least 1.2 bar pressure at a hot idle. So let me connect the multimeter and we'll see what this thing is cold oil pressure, because right now the engine is still cold, and we'll verify that the pressure is okay. As you can see, I've got my gauge zeroed out. We're going to start the car up now. Now, obviously, at this point, you're going to have your red oil warning light on the dash. Don't be alarmed. Obviously, it's because we have disconnected the oil pressure switch. As you can see here, my cold oil pressure is 27.4 psi. Like I said, the spec for a hot idle is basically 1.2 bar. So it's 14.7 psi equals 1 bar. So obviously I'm more than 14, so I am on the high end of my range. The engine is cold, so I would expect a much higher oil pressure anyway. As the engine gets hotter, the clearances get a little bigger, the oil thins out, my oil pressure is going to drop. So I'm going to let this thing run a little bit till it gets hot, and then we're going to check the hot idle oil pressure. Okay, so this thing has only been idling now for about a minute or so, and you can see the oil pressure is already dropped. I guess that's about 10 psi or so, and it's still continuing to drop. The engine isn't even fully warm yet. It's getting hotter, but it's already starting to drop. It's been about another minute or so. You can see the oil pressure is still dropping. Still not even fully warmed up. But now I'm touching 15 psi or so. Like I said, the limit is 1.2 bar, which is basically, I don't know exactly 15. Off the top of my head, I'm going to say 15.4, 15.5, somewhere in that range. But I am really right now below it, right? Because 1 bar would be 14.7, and it is still dropping. And at this point too, if I rev the engine up, say about 2,000 RPM and let off, I can hear the valve train rattle like there's marbles in the engine. So this is just sort of double confirming my suspicion that this thing actually does have low oil pressure. So rather than continuing this thing down till my oil pressure drops any further, causes any kind of actual damage. I'm now going to start tearing down this engine so I can see what is causing my oil pressure issue. A couple of things I want to point out here. I will often use this oil pressure gauge and test to verify if my pickup screen is clogging. Now, if I was suspecting an issue where there was debris, whether it be carbon deposits, bad oil, just old timing chain debris, the plastics and stuff, which I have seen that have broken up, ended up in the oil pan, and you get a low oil pressure issue when you're driving down the highway, not when you're coming to a light and the oil pressure is dropping. It's generally when the RPMs are higher and sustained for a little while that your oil pressure light comes on. In that case, I would suspect that the pickup screen itself is clogging and that you need to remove the oil pan, inspect the pickup screen, inspect for debris in the oil pan. Could also be a sludge issue, poor oil quality, poor oil maintenance. This is not doing that. And the way I would test for that in a steady state like this is I'd hook up my oil pressure gauge. I would then sit in a car where I could view the gauge, and I would rev the engine up to let's say 2,500 RPM or so, and hold it there. If the pickup screen is clogging, you should see the oil pressure gradually start to drop. And it will drop to the point where you're at low oil pressure. You have to be very careful. If it starts dropping too much, too fast, you need to stop immediately because it is an oil starvation issue. You're not getting enough oil to the engine. So be very, very careful. Basically, as soon as I see at a higher RPM my oil pressure starts dropping, I know right away, okay, I need to pull the oil pan down. I need to inspect this pickup. This doesn't do that. If I hold the RPMs up, although my oil pressure is lower than it should be, it stays at that same oil pressure value. For instance, on this, at about 2,200 RPMs, I'm seeing about 30 PSI. It will stay there no matter how long I hold it. Granted, it is below what the spec is. And again, I'll try to put it in the description below what I found Audi calls out for the specifications at different RPMs. But again, it stays at that value. It's not gradually dropping down to nothing. As the screen's picking up, it can't pick up oil. So I just wanted to put that little caveat in here. Unfortunately, there are a lot of common issues with these motors. The bearings for balance shafts fail, and that causes an oil pressure issue. The oil pump being a two-stage, I've seen and heard reports of the oil pump failing. The other one is the adjuster for the timing chain itself. Either if your chain is stretched too far, that tensioner is extended too far, you get an oil bleed off from that, loss of oil pressure. I've even heard reports of people saying the oil squirters that are there to cool the bottoms of the pistons, though you can leak excessively. There's just a whole slew of things that could be wrong. The predicament this person's in, a new long block is on the average of about $8,000, not shipped from Audi. So you also have to figure in labor to remove this engine, swap everything over, and then put that engine in. Could be quite substantial. The other option is you get a used engine, but again, you have no idea the history of the engine. You don't know what's wrong with it. So we made the decision to tear down the engine and see if we can't find the smoking gun of what's causing this low oil pressure. So that's, again, what this video is basically about. I'm going to take you guys through the steps of what I'm going to do, because obviously I haven't taken it apart yet. I have no idea what's causing this low oil pressure, but we're going to tear into this thing and we're going to try to find that smoking gun. So with all our tests out of the way, our confirmed low oil pressure, the first thing we need to do here is we're going to get this thing into service position. So service position, for those of you that don't work on Audis normally, is basically the removal, or at least the loosening, of what they call the lock carrier, which is the radiator support. On this particular model, there are pivots on the bottom, which are excellent if you just need to get access to the front of the motor. You basically remove the bumper cover, loosen up a few bolts here, and you can tilt the front assembly to give you room and space in front of the motor to work on. Since I may potentially have to remove the balance shafts, and for the sake of this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to completely remove the front lock carrier assembly. So I'm going to drain the coolant. I'm going to disconnect the transcooler lines. I'm going to disconnect the intercooler since this is a front mount intercooler. And I'm going to just remove the whole front lock carrier. I'll have perfect access to the front of the motor, and it will give you guys a better view of what I'm doing in here. Okay guys, so I just want to give you a quick overview of how to get this thing into service position. In my case, I'm obviously, like I said, I'm going to remove the entire lock carrier assembly. But the methods for just about every Audi Volkswagen are pretty similar. Obviously, there's differences from model year to model year and from model to model. But on this Q5, it's pretty straightforward. So first thing we need to do is obviously remove the bumper cover. There are a few Torx bolts along the side edge here on the splash shields for both the driver's and passenger side. We then need to remove the top lock carrier cover here. These are push pin fasteners. Basically, you push the center down and then you can release the pin itself to remove this cover. There are 2 bolts underneath the cover that hold the bumper cover on here. And from that point, I believe there are 2 more bolts, or maybe a couple of bolts underneath that hold the bumper cover to the lock carrier itself. So those need to come off. Then the bumper cover basically just pulls off of the fender. It's held in with like a retaining clip here. Pulls off, the bumper cover should come off. Be mindful of the fog lights if you have. You will have to disconnect the electrical connection. Generally, there's one central connector. Since both headlights are tied together, disconnect that connector. If you do have headlight washers, you also have to disconnect that tube. Again, every model is a little different, but just keep that in mind. Once the bumper cover is off, a couple other things you need to do. The hood release is a 2-piece cable. If I can get this guy off of here. There we go. The metal bracket will come off, and if you look here closely, there's a little pin there and a slide portion here. Basically, this cover is going to come up, and there is 2 spots where this cable has a little ball detent. This one has it as well. Just take one end or the other off and get it out of the way so you can then separate it from the lock carrier. Obviously, I need to disconnect my radiator hoses, my coolant reservoir here. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to disconnect my transmission cooler lines. Probably going to do it from the soft lines down below. Again, only because I'm completely removing this to gain full access to the front of the motor. You don't necessarily need to do that if you're just trying to get to like the timing chain. As I mentioned, this support has a set of bars on either end for a pivot. That's basically so you can tilt the lock carrier into service position. It still holds it basically from falling off of the car. Again, since I'm removing it all, I'm going to disconnect those from there so I can get this off completely. Once that's all off, there's obviously your impact or your structural bumper underneath. There's bolts there that'll need to come off. We'll get that out of the way. The intercooler tubing needs to come off as well, since there is a front mount intercooler here. Basically, everything that's attached to this lock carrier, I just need to get off. So, without further ado, I'm going to set up the time lapse and I'm going to get this front end off. as you can see, I've got the whole front carrier assembly off. And like I said, there is a couple of key differences from every make and model. So just real briefly, I want to go over a couple of the things that need to be removed, or at least loosened up. I made mention of the bolts on the top of the lock carrier. Those need to come off. But just below, there's also a T30 on either side here that needs to come off as well. The metal impact bumper has 3 16mm hex bolts and 1 T30 that holds it to the lock carrier itself. There's the impact bumper there. Since I was removing the entire lock carrier to save the air conditioning system so I didn't have to discharge and then recharge the system, I wanted to leave the condenser, evaporator, I always get them mixed up, connected. So in order to do that, I needed to remove the impact bumper so that I can get to the air dams that are on either side and also be able to snake the hard lines away from that impact bumper and get the condenser up and then out of the way. So I have it now swung out of the way. And as you can see, I've got all the room in the world here to gain access to the whole front of the motor. A couple of things real briefly. I just want to point out, I do have videos that address the 2-liter FSI or TFSI motor. I'll probably put up here somewhere a card, sort of link that you can go to if you want to see how to do that. I will touch on it a little bit in this video, I'm sure. But basically, it's pretty straightforward what you need to do to get to the timing components. Obviously, you want to set the engine at TDC, removing the serpentine belt. We'll have to take the tensioner off. A couple other things you want to be mindful of. The lower cover is a metal cover. It is not very thick. It is also held on with Volkswagen's silicone sealant, so it does stick very tightly to the engine itself. Be careful when you go to remove that off. If you bend it, crease it, distort it too much, it's going to leak. Just be, very careful when you go to pry it off. They do have kits where you could buy it new just for that reason. But, again, just be mindful of that. The upper cover is very easy. It's a regular gasket, a couple of T30s on there, and that guy will come off like that. Okay, a couple of things at this point that I wanted to show you guys. So here's my timing mark for my exhaust camshaft and the timing mark for the intake camshaft. And then I want to put to rest some confusion that a lot of people have here. And if you look at the metal cover, I know it's a little hard to see on here, but there is an arrow on the top of the cover there. Any of you guys that are familiar with the old 1.8Ts, that's about where the timing mark was. On the 2 liters, it's actually down on the side here. And again, guys, I'm sorry, it's really hard to see, but there is a second arrow here. And then there are notches on the damper where you need to line that up. So to make sure this is at TDC, those 2 marks are going to line up. And the 2 marks on your camshafts up there are going to line up. Another thing I want to point out is if you're following, ELSA or a Bentley manual, there is a crazy elaborate tool that holds the damper so you can remove the bolt and then allows you to install a tool that holds the chain sprocket to the crankshaft, because it's actually has a series of, for lack of a better term, like triangles that it keys into on the crankshaft. There's no keyway or a slip to that gear. So if you're just taking this up for inspection, you need to be very careful that does not come out. Generally what I do is I'll take the damper off and then I'll put the bolt back in place to hold everything there while I remove the cover. So I just want to make you guys aware of that. You need to be careful, because if that comes out of its grooves, you know, a couple things can happen. Your timing will be off, your damper won't sit right, you'll get a horrendous vibration. So just be mindful of that. So I got the lower pan off. I can now see the oil pump. I will probably take this little baffle down just to, you know, see a little bit better. Okay, so looking at the oil pan, this is the lower pan I removed. And I know it's not really coming through very well, but there it is. You can see there is metal flakes sitting in the pan. They don't appear to be magnetic, because that is a magnetic drain plug. There is a little bit of metal on there, but I don't see any other real heavy metallic. You can see, you know, a lot of carbon deposits on here as well. So, you know, I don't know the full history on here. Perhaps they did a flush on it, but there is metal in my pan. So I think my next step now is I'm going to remove the cam adjusting bolt here. There is a special tool you need to get this off. I'll remove the cam bridge and then start removing the cam timing and the balance shaft timing. Ultimately, what I'm trying to do here is I want to get to the balance shafts, and I also want to inspect the end of the camshaft here and make sure there's no heavy gouging or anything crazy in there. I'll show it when it's off. I also want to point out there's a screen that's behind here as well. A lot of times they blow out. I usually will even just remove it completely. I don't see it necessary. I've heard reports from other people as well. It's not really all that important, but a lot of times it will blow out and or clog. So this is another area we want to check out. One other thing I'm going to point out here, I could see that someone was in here already. The hydraulic tensioner for the cam timing is or has been changed. And a lot of times, and the reason I could tell here is it's actually been ground down. And what they do is they'll take a factory tensioner and they grind off the basically the part number. So that one has been changed. Also looks like the balance shaft tensioner is changed as well. So, you know, I'm a big proponent of using factory parts, or at least OE parts, when it comes to critical engine parts like this timing setup. So hopefully I could find what's actually damaged, and regardless of the fact that my timing chain, at least looking through my measured value blocks, is not stretched at all, so I know there's not a lot of wear, I'm definitely going to replace both these tensioners with a factory one. So I've got this thing all apart. As you can see, I've got lots of parts sitting here. My balance shafts, you know, the screens look pretty clear on both the intake and the exhaust side. I mean, there's some debris in there, but nothing looks, you know, too out of place. This one screen here, this one's blown out, but it is clear. I don't really see any damage here on the balance shafts. The only thing I did really notice is on the cam bridge, and the screen's blown out, which isn't unusual. That happens quite a bit. There's actually a technical bolt in for that. But what I did notice is it was completely pushed out, and if you look in there, the check valve itself is pushed out of the bore a bit. I mean, it's not loose. I can't just sort of, you know, grab this thing to pull it out. And again, I don't know if the spring just kind of sits down in there and that's holding the check valve. You know, it does feel very weak, like there's not a lot of spring pressure. So again, if this cap is just holding the spring and the seat there, you know, and it's now up much higher, obviously it's not putting as much pressure on that seat for that little check valve. And yeah, I would lose quite a bit of oil pressure there. So again, this is the only thing I noticed as wrong on this. Now it does have an aftermarket timing chain kit, the tensioner for the, oh sorry for the focus, the tensioner for the balance shaft is aftermarket, as well as the tensioner for the main drive chain is an aftermarket one. Again, I don't know if they're, you know, causing any issues or contributing to it. You know, I'm really hoping that this is the smoking gun. So looking at the engine, the only other thing I noticed is on the exhaust cam, and I'm sorry it doesn't really show well on the camera. There are some scores in it. You know, nothing that I could really feel with my fingernail as terrible. This maybe it was caused from when the screen blew out and just sort of gotten chewed up by the camshaft there. The oil port for that cam bridge is hidden behind my homemade locking tools for the cams. But I checked all in there with a flashlight and I don't see any blockages there. But yeah, I mean, everything looks, you know, okay. Even the oil pump. This is the shaft that changes the changeover for the oil pump. I mean, this thing moves free. It's not jamming up. It's not hanging up at all. I removed the solenoid for the changeover valve. That has a screen in as well. It is completely clear. No issues there at all. But because I am this far, I am probably, I think my course of action is, just because I am this far, I'm going to replace the oil pump. Again, I don't think that's bad at all. I'm just going to do it just because I am this far into it. I'm going to replace the changeover valve. Again, I don't think it's bad. When I disconnected it electrically, I do see a slight increase in oil pressure. So it is doing something. Again, just sort of a peace of mind. I'm just going to change it. The main tensioner here, which was aftermarket, I'm going to replace it as well. Again, it's not very expensive in the scheme of things. Just going to replace it. The guides, the chains, everything else looked okay. I did check the chain stretch. Well, I call it chain stretch, but again, I checked the measure value block, and I am well within what I have ever seen as a stretch chain or a worn chain in guides. Everything looks okay. There's not a lot of wear in the guides or the chain itself. And then obviously the main part I'm going to replace is the cam bridge. So I'm hoping that's the real issue in my low oil pressure situation. Just because some people might ask, I did also remove the oil filter. I checked the drain back valve there. It is in place. It is okay. Nothing wrong, but I am going to put a factory oil filter on this thing, as well as fill it with factory oil. I believe this one calls for a 540, which is what I'm going to put into this thing. So I just wanted to give you guys the quick update of where I am, because at this point I'm going to have to order parts, and it'll be a little while before they come in. In the meantime, I'm going to take all the parts that I have that I am going to reuse, and I'm going to clean them up all very well, blow them out, compressed air, make sure all the passages that, you know, stuff I'm going to reuse is clear, as well as, you know, what passages I can get to on the motor and make sure they're all blown out and clear, and I know I have no blockages.